The air was thick with the faint, stale scent of cheap tobacco and industrial cleaning fluid. Rain, a cold, persistent drizzle, tapped against the lone window high up on the wall, adding a rhythmic, unsettling soundtrack to the silence. Major Dmitry Volkov of the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, the counterintelligence arm, leaned back in his worn, squeaking leather chair. His eyes, perpetually tired, were fixed on the scarred oak table before him, where two objects lay under the harsh glare of a single desk lamp. One object was a confiscated, American-made Zippo lighter, chrome glinting dully. The other was an ordinary-looking fountain pen, the kind a mid-level bureaucrat or a traveling salesman might carry. Volkov watched his colleague, Captain Alexander Korovin, a man whose reputation for technical expertise preceded him, delicately manipulate the lighter. Korovin was wearing thin cotton gloves, treating the mundane object with a reverence usually reserved for unstable explosives. "They brought him in 3 hours ago," Volkov murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The usual story. Diplomatic aid. Too interested in the Vostochny aircraft blueprints. Too close to the fence line at the design bureau. Korovin nodded, not looking up. He worked the hinge of the lighter with a specialized tool. He'd already x-rayed both objects, a standard procedure for anything recovered from a suspected foreign agent. But the results had been confusing. The Zippo, instead of the expected fluid-soaked cotton and flint wheel, contained a tightly packed spool of something that looked like photographic film. The pen was even more bizarre. Its barrel wasn't hollow for ink. It was packed solid, except for a tiny, barely perceptible pinhole where a clip should have been. The American, Howard Vance. Korovin finally spoke, his Russian precise, almost pedantic. He insists they're simply personal effects. Gifts. He laughs, Major. Says we are making much of nothing. Korovin grunted, a sound of professional irritation. He called them igrushka, toys. Volkov pushed a hand through his thinning, sandy hair. The fools at the First Chief Directorate, our foreign spies, they hear rumors of these miniaturized spy tools the Americans call Minox. They scoff. How can a camera the size of a finger take a useful photograph? They ask. It is American exaggeration. He leaned closer, the shadow of his heavy brow falling across the table. I have never believed it was exaggeration, Alexander. Not with the CIA's budget. Not with the talent they attract. Korovin's tool slipped under the decorative chrome band of a lighter. There was a faint metallic click. The entire outer casing slid upward, revealing the true mechanism inside. It was a marvel of miniaturization. A lens assembly no bigger than a shirt button, a tiny shutter, and a cassette of specialized film, less than a centimeter wide. The film inside was exposed. Look at this, Major, Korovin breathed, holding the disassembled object up to the light. The lens is a Minotaur element. Precision ground glass, probably German-made, smuggled out. The focal distance is fixed, extremely short, designed for documents, not landscapes. Volkov stared. It was undeniably a camera, ingeniously concealed. A camera that could sit on a desk during a meeting or be placed inside a waistcoat pocket and used to photograph documents while an agent feigned tying a shoelace. It was practically invisible in operation. The laughter of the First Chief Directorate suddenly sounded hollow, foolish. This was no toy. It was a weapon. And the pen? Volkov demanded, his voice now tight with anticipation. Korovin dismantled the fountain pen just as methodically. This time, the mechanism was even more subtle. No moving parts were visible from the outside. The clip was the shutter, operated by a tiny lever hidden beneath the cap. The film canister was inside the barrel, an even smaller roll than the one in the lighter. The pinhole Volkov had observed was the actual lens aperture. They're not just using these, Major, Korovin said, laying out the components. They're manufacturing them specifically for espionage. Mass production, perhaps. This is a dedicated effort to compromise our highest secrets at the source. Forget the bulky field cameras of the war. We are in a new era of spycraft. Volkov reached out, his gloved fingers hovering over the tiny, exposed roll of film from the Zippo. This was the ultimate prize. The film the American agent Howard Vance had risked everything for. If the rumors were true, if the optics were truly this good, the potential damage was incalculable. Develop the film, Captain Volkov ordered, his eyes never leaving the minuscule roll. Use the highest resolution techniques. I want to see what this American has captured. I want to know exactly what kind of toy he was playing with. The KGB Technical Lab, a cavernous, dimly lit room usually reserved for analyzing radio intercepts and tampering with locks, was prepped for this specific task. The film was so small, so thin, that Korovin had to handle it with specialized tweezers, feeling immense pressure. This was a critical test. If the images were blurry, indistinct, the Americans would have wasted their effort, and the KGB could breathe easy. If they were sharp, then the real work would begin. The work of containment, of compromise assessment, of finding every single one of these miniature weapons. The fate of several Soviet strategic programs might hang on the quality of a picture taken by a camera disguised as a common desk accessory. The development process for the Minox film was agonizingly slow, a testament to its miniature size and the KGB's desire for absolute perfection. Captain Korovin worked under a single, deep red safe light, his face beaded with sweat despite the cool basement air. The film strip itself was less than 10 inches long, a ribbon of acetate, so thin it seemed liable to tear from the sheer humidity of the lab. He used a specialized developing tank, one designed for microdot analysis, to process the incredibly fine-grained Kodak emulsion. Major Volkov remained in the observation booth, separated from the lab by a pane of frosted glass. He didn't pace. He sat motionless, elbows on his knees, his chin resting on his interlaced fingers, watching the silhouette of Korovin move with practiced economy. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle slosh of chemical baths being poured and drained. Volkov felt a heavy, cold knot tighten in his stomach. The realization that the American intelligence apparatus, the CIA, had achieved this level of miniaturization was not just a technical setback, it was an intelligence catastrophe. It meant that trust was now an even more expensive commodity, and that the most mundane office object could be watching you. 45 minutes later, Korovin emerged, carrying the results pinned to a small, wooden drying frame. He held it up gingerly. The film, now fixed and dried, was still almost invisible to the naked eye, a dark, narrow line. The image quality, Major, Korovin said, his voice flat with disbelief. I needed to see it enlarged to believe it. He led Volkov into the adjoining viewing room, a small space dominated by a massive, custom-built photographic enlarger. Korovin placed the fragile Minox negative into the carrier, his movements precise. He adjusted the focus wheel. A square of brilliant white light flooded the projection table. Then, slowly, as the image came into sharp, breathtaking focus, both men drew a sharp intake of breath. Projected onto the table was a section of a technical blueprint. It was huge now, easily 3 feet across. But the astonishing part was the clarity. Every line, every annotation, every tiny measurement in Cyrillic was sharp, crisp, and completely legible. It was an image taken from barely 6 inches away, capturing an entire A1-size document in a fraction of a second. The depth of field was incredible. The grain of the paper itself was visible. "It's the R7, Volkov whispered, his fatigue instantly forgotten, replaced by a searing, white-hot professional rage. The R-7 was the Soviet Union's first intercontinental ballistic missile, the design that would ultimately launch Sputnik and the heart of their entire nuclear deterrent. This section was a close-up of the NPO Energomash engine combustion chamber assembly, a detail considered top secret even within the design bureau itself. Korovin pointed a slender metal pointer at the projected image. He didn't just photograph a title page, Major. He captured the critical engineering specifications. The tolerances, the alloy composition, the wiring schematics for the ignition sequence. Korovin's gloved hand trembled slightly. He had access to the master blueprint folder. He placed the Zippo on the desk, and pressed the flint wheel once. That's all it took. Volkov walked around the projection table, inspecting the image from every angle. It was damning, terrifying evidence. The image was perfect. The American agent Vance had not merely succeeded. He had succeeded with arrogant ease, using a device the KGB had dismissed as a cheap trick. The mockery of the Soviet spies now tasted like ash in Volkov's mouth. The CIA wasn't just playing games. They were fundamentally undermining Soviet security at the highest possible level. How much of the document is on the entire film? Volkov asked, his voice low and controlled, masking the panic he felt. Korovin quickly cycled through the remaining exposures. Each one revealed a different, critical section of the R-7 blueprints. In total, Vance had captured key schematics for the guidance system, the stage separation mechanism, and the telemetry relay unit. Enough information, when pieced together, to give the Americans a devastating insight into the missile's capability, its vulnerabilities, and its production timeline. He got everything he needed, Major, Korovin confirmed, switching off the enlarger. The room plunged into a relieved but fearful darkness. This camera, this toy, is the single most dangerous piece of surveillance equipment we have ever encountered. Volkov leaned against the cool metal casing of the enlarger, running a hand over his face. The immediate problem of the R-7 damage assessment was massive, but the long-term strategic implications were paralyzing. How many more of these Minox devices were already in circulation? In which ministries, which design bureaus, which military commands? Every single foreign embassy employee, every journalist, every trade delegate could now be carrying a perfect, silent photographic spy in their pocket. Captain Korovin, Volkov commanded, his tone hardening, his mind already shifting into crisis mode. Contact the Technical Operations Directorate. They are to secure the original camera components and film. They will study this device, reverse engineer it. Every officer in the Second Chief Directorate must be immediately briefed on the appearance and function of the Minox. Every suspected agent is to be searched, not just for weapons and radios, but for fountain pens, lighters, cigarette cases, anything that does not function exactly as it should. We need a code name for this operation. A warning. He looked back at the small, narrow strip of film still pinned to the frame. It was the photographic equivalent of a punch to the gut. Call it Operation Pinpoint. We need to find every single one of these pinhole spies before they bleed the Soviet Union dry. The KGB's contempt for the miniature camera had just been replaced by a healthy, professional terror. The fallout from the Vance incident and the photographic evidence of the Minox camera's capabilities was swift and brutal within the highest echelons of the KGB. Major Volkov's report landed on the desk of General Serov, the chairman of the Committee for State Security, within 12 hours. The attached 3-foot by 3-foot projection of the R-7 ICBM engine specifications served as a silent, undeniable testimony to the security breach. The previous dismissals of toy cameras were now grounds for demotion or worse. Operation Pinpoint was immediately formalized. Its mandate was twofold. First, damage assessment, to understand exactly what critical secrets had already been lost through these miniaturized devices, and second, technological defense, to quickly develop countermeasures and, critically, to produce a Soviet version of the Minox for their own foreign intelligence operations. The Soviets, once ahead in the sheer manpower of espionage, were suddenly scrambling to catch up in the technical field. Volkov, now elevated to the head of the task force, instituted a sweeping, intrusive new protocol across all key Soviet installations, particularly the design bureaus, OKBs, and the defense ministries. Every visitor, every technician, every employee returning from a mandated trip abroad was subjected to a rigorous search. Metal detectors were useless against these tiny devices, often encased in plastic or thin metal. "We are looking for anomalies, comrades," Volkov instructed a training group of new counterintelligence operatives in a sterile, underground classroom. A fountain pen that is too heavy, a pocket watch that lacks its mechanism, a lipstick case that feels solid. These devices are sacrifices of function for the sake of espionage. They may look normal, but they will not feel normal. You must learn to trust your hands. The Technical Operations Directorate, ODU, under the direction of the brilliant but mercurial engineer Colonel Ivan Kurchatov, no relation to the nuclear physicist, took possession of the captured cameras. Kurchatov was fascinated, almost reverently so, by the precision of the American and, ironically, original Latvian design. The Minox had roots dating back to the late 1930s, but the CIA had perfected it. "It is the lens, Major," Kurchatov explained to Volkov one afternoon, peering through a stereo microscope at the tiny Minotaur element. "The aperture is fixed at an extremely small diameter, perhaps f/3.5. This maximizes the depth of field while minimizing light loss. This is not just a spy camera. It is a piece of optical jewelry. To mass-produce lenses of this quality, at this size, is a formidable industrial challenge." The challenge for the KGB's ODU was immediate: replication. They needed a Soviet Minox, a miniature spy camera, or camera malinki, to issue to their own agents operating in Washington, London, and Bonn. They could not afford to lag behind. The project was codenamed Colibri, Hummingbird, due to the camera's small size and rapid function. However, the Soviet optical industry, while capable of producing excellent lenses for larger aerial reconnaissance cameras, struggled with the miniature precision required for the Colibri. The tolerances were too tight, the required glass purity too high. Initial prototypes were plagued by spherical aberration, a blurriness at the edges of the photo that would render the text on a document illegible. "Our lenses are good enough for pictures of the Eiffel Tower, Colonel," Volkov observed drily during a frustrating review of blurred prototype images. "They are useless for pictures of NATO defense plans." Kurchatov, stung by the technical failure, ordered a desperate measure: a full reverse engineering tear-down of the captured Zippo and pen cameras. Every component, from the brass casing to the tiny shutter spring, was analyzed, measured, and charted. They even developed an X-ray spectrometer test to determine the exact metal alloys used in the lens mounts. The irony was palpable. The Soviet state, committed to ideological superiority, was reduced to forensic imitation of its enemies' espionage tools. To combat the immediate threat, Operation Pinpoint focused on three main targets: diplomatic missions. Every briefcase, package, and person associated with Western embassies was put under intense, multi-spectral surveillance. Liaison personnel. The Soviet citizens working as drivers, cleaners, and administrative assistants for foreigners were rigorously vetted and, in many cases, coerced into becoming informers, specifically tasked with looking for unusual writing instruments. The paper trail. Volkov instituted new rules for the handling of top-secret documents. Blueprint paper was changed to a slightly darker, blue-tinted stock, an attempt to confuse the automatic light metering of the Minox cameras, hoping to overexpose the photos. The rule was established: no critical document may be left unattended on a desk surface, even for a moment. The psychological effect of the Minox on the Soviet leadership was profound. It fed the pre-existing paranoia, making the enemy seem omnipresent and technologically superior. They had laughed at the toy cameras, but the laughter died the moment they saw the perfect, enlarged image of the R-7's combustion chamber details. The miniature device had proven that the Cold War was not just a battle of tanks and missiles, but a silent, unseen struggle for the secrets on the desks of engineers. The KGB's priority had shifted completely. They had to catch the next Minox agent, and they had to build their own. The technical spy race was on. The CIA, keenly aware that the Minox was now compromised in Moscow. After all, their agent Howard Vance had been arrested, didn't simply discard the device. Instead, they recognized that the initial shockwave created by the Vance incident was a psychological weapon in itself. The KGB's focus would be entirely on searching fountain pens and lighters, a necessary but ultimately predictable pattern. The CIA's Technical Services Division, TSD, decided to immediately diversify the camera's disguises, maximizing the window of panic in Moscow. The Minox became the multi-platform spy. In Washington, D.C., Director of Central Intelligence Alan Dulles was reportedly delighted with the effectiveness of the small camera. It provided the high-quality intelligence needed to assess Soviet capabilities, allowing U.S. defense planners to accurately gauge the actual threat posed by the R-7 missile rather than relying on flawed estimates. The clarity of the photos meant the difference between knowing the Soviets had an ICBM and knowing how that ICBM actually worked. The CIA's TSD rapidly commissioned new casing designs. Suddenly, the ultra-miniature Minox camera mechanisms, which were technically superior to anything the Soviets had, began appearing in the most unexpected objects. Cufflinks, a pair of gold-plated cufflinks worn by a cultural attaché that photographed documents by simply adjusting the angle of the wrist. Matchbooks, the spine of a promotional matchbook used by agents in cafes and restaurants to quickly photograph newspaper articles or handwritten notes on tables. Belt buckles, a seemingly innocuous belt buckle with a lever hidden on the underside, allowing an agent to lean casually over a desk while talking, snapping high-resolution images of papers placed nearby. The key was plausibility and ephemera. If the Soviets were looking for expensive, well-made objects like the Zippo and the pen, the CIA would use cheap, disposable items that nobody would suspect or bother to hold on to. In Moscow, Volkov's Operation Pinpoint was grinding through the Soviet bureaucracy, hampered by two major factors: the sheer volume of personnel to search and a lack of standardized Minox look. "They are not consistent, Major," lamented Captain Korovin during a briefing where he displayed a collection of confiscated Western novelty items. "We found a camera disguised as a miniature sewing kit on a diplomatic spouse, and another inside the heel of an imported boot on a trade official. It's too diffuse. Our men are spending hours dismantling trivial possessions." The Soviet response focused heavily on physical security, which was easier to enforce than human counterintelligence. Volkov ordered the installation of clear top desks in high-security offices. Any document left on the desk could be seen from the hallway or through the frosted glass of the office door. More drastically, in sensitive planning rooms, he mandated that all documents must be physically clipped to a board and placed inside a secure cabinet between viewings, even if the user stepped away for only a minute. The constant fetching and storing of documents was inefficient, but it created a moment-to-moment psychological barrier against the quick-draw Minox photographer. Meanwhile, the CIA began to exploit the paranoia they had fostered. They introduced dummy Minox devices, fountain pens that looked like the capture camera but contained no mechanism, or perhaps only blank film. These dummy devices were planted in the belongings of minor agents or those the CIA considered expendable, knowing that their inevitable discovery by the KGB would lead to massive intelligence overreaction and the waste of valuable KGB resources. One such incident occurred in the Soviet sector of Berlin in 1957. A Polish agent working for the CIA, codenamed Sparrow, was caught attempting to cross the checkpoint with a briefcase. Inside the lining, KGB agents found a meticulously crafted belt buckle camera. When Colonel Volkov received the report, he demanded the immediate development of the film. Korovin and his team worked through the night. The resulting images were stunningly sharp, but utterly useless. They were close-ups of Sparrow's own lapel, the lining of his overcoat, and the floor of a streetcar. "It is nonsense, Major," Korovin stated, frustrated, pointing to the blurred image of a street curb. It appears the agent photographed his own feet for 3 exposures and his knee for the other 7. Volkov, however, didn't laugh. He stared at the perfect sharpness of the coat fabric. "It's a distraction, Captain. They're showing us that they have advanced their casing technology. The camera is perfect, but the intelligence is garbage. They want us to waste effort tracing these random devices while the real ones are still in Moscow, photographing nuclear reactor schematics." The CIA's strategy was clear: make the Minox an omnipresent ghost. By varying the disguises and planting misleading evidence, they forced the KGB to treat every foreign object as a potential threat, paralyzing the flow of information and causing widespread disruption. The miniature camera was no longer just an intelligence-gathering tool. It had become an instrument of psychological warfare, proving that the greatest secrets could be stolen in plain sight, with nothing but a flick of the wrist. The KGB was being buried under a mountain of surveillance and technical countermeasures, all triggered by a piece of precision-machined metal smaller than a tube of lipstick. While Major Volkov's Operation Pinpoint dealt with the messy, high-friction work of counterintelligence on the ground, the Technical Operations Directorate, ODU, under Colonel Kurchatov was locked in a brutal technological race to produce the Soviet equivalent, Project Kolibri. The need for the Kolibri, a camera capable of the same document-grade fidelity as the Minox, was not just operational. It was a matter of Soviet pride and strategic parity. The KGB couldn't afford to be the only major intelligence agency unable to take a perfect document photo in a hostile office. The bottleneck remained the optics. The Soviet Union could build rockets and tanks, but the micro-tolerances required for the tiny, high-refraction lenses of the Minox were proving insurmountable. Kurchatov's initial attempts using repurposed lenses from older medical equipment resulted in grainy, unusable images. The difference between a sharp photograph that captured the 0.1 millimeter line width of a blueprint and a blurry one that only captured the title was the difference between operational intelligence and worthless paper. The Minotaur lens assembly, Major, Kurchatov explained, running a finger over a detailed diagram of the captured lens during a review meeting. It's not just the glass, it's the coating, the spacing, the temperature control during the grinding process. They're achieving submicron precision. We have the design, but we lack the craftsmanship and the specialized machine tools. In a desperate maneuver typical of the Soviet system, the KGB turned to its own intelligence networks for a solution. They initiated a specific intelligence acquisition mission, codenamed Lens Grinder, with the singular goal of stealing the necessary technical specifications, tooling blueprints, or, failing that, the actual optical engineers responsible for the Minox lens production in Western Europe. Volkov, meanwhile, was forced to adapt his espionage tactics because of the technological handicap. Since the KGB couldn't reliably take document photos abroad, they shifted focus to coercive recruitment and document compromise. Instead of relying on a spy to photograph documents, they had to recruit an insider who could physically substitute a real document for a fake one, or simply steal the original outright. This was riskier, slower, and required more deep cover work, but it bypassed the Minox problem. We cannot compete on the miniaturization of the camera, Volkov conceded to his senior staff. So, we compete on the miniaturization of the film transfer. We need ways to get large documents out without a camera. This led to the revival and refinement of older, more analog spy techniques. Microdots. Documents were photographed, reduced to the size of a period, dot symbol, and glued onto postcards or letters. This technique was cumbersome and required bulky viewing equipment, but it was virtually undetectable on casual search. Chemical transfer. Specialized paper and solvents were developed to chemically lift the ink from a document onto a thin layer of transfer material, which could then be rolled up and concealed in a tube of toothpaste or a hollowed-out coin. But these methods were pale imitations of the Minox's efficiency. The Minox allowed an agent to photograph hundreds of pages in minutes and required no physical destruction or alteration of the original document. It was instantaneous, clean, and silent. The Kolibri project was hemorrhaging resources, and the lack of a working prototype was a source of deep embarrassment to the entire directorate. The breakthrough, when it finally came, wasn't a technological one, but an ideological betrayal. In 1958, a low-level Czech optical engineer named Miroslav Olah defected to the East. He didn't bring any blueprints for the Minox, which had its origins in Latvia, but he brought the vital knowledge of high-precision Western grinding machinery and the specific chemical composition of the specialized lanthanum glass required for the tiny lens elements. He didn't bring the Minox, Major, Colonel Kurchatov reported excitedly. But he brought the knowledge to build the machine that builds the Minox. It saves us 5 years of trial and error. Within 6 months, Using OLA's knowledge, the OTU was able to successfully produce the Tessar-type lens required for the Colibri. The initial Soviet camera was crude, bulky, and slightly larger than the original Minox, encased not in a stylish Zippo, but a blocky, industrial-looking cigarette case. It was christened the A8. The moment of truth came when Volkov personally supervised the test of the first operational A8. They photographed a blueprint of a dummy missile warhead. The film was developed and projected. The image was sharp, clear, and perfectly legible. The KGB had finally closed the technical gap on the miniature spy camera. But the victory was bittersweet. It had taken 3 years of intensive effort, expense, and strategic diversion to achieve what the CIA had been doing effortlessly since the early 1950s. The Soviet Union had their own toy camera, but by the time it manufactured the A8, the CIA had moved on, integrating microcameras into clothing, shoes, and even buttons, leaving the KGB to chase a constantly evolving miniature target. The laughter had stopped, but the race was far from over. The successful deployment of the A8 Colibri in 1959 finally allowed the KGB's first Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence, to compete on the technological stage. However, Major Volkov, now promoted to colonel, realized that merely possessing a miniature camera wasn't enough. The CIA had already established technological superiority and, more importantly, a sophisticated operational doctrine for using the Minox. Volkov's new mandate was to neutralize the CIA's presence in Moscow using the lessons learned from the chaos of Operation Pinpoint. The new operational doctrine was simple: trap the camera, expose the network. Volkov's team focused its attention on a specific group of technical officers attached to the American embassy, men and women who had clearances to enter sensitive areas of Soviet-managed facilities for diplomatic or inspection purposes. One such target was a junior signals officer named Edward Barlow. Barlow was a meticulous, unremarkable man who drove an expensive, imported Ford and frequented a particular open-air market for Western newspapers. Volkov decided to test Barlow using a control compromise. They needed to lure the Minox out into the open. The target document chosen was an outdated schematic for the Novosibirsk radar array, a system that the Soviets had quietly upgraded 3 months prior. The schematic was genuine, classified, and, crucially, strategically obsolete, a perfect bait. The setup was elaborate. KGB agents cultivated a relationship with the Soviet cleaning woman at the signals office, a paid informant named Ludmila. Ludmila was instructed to accidentally leave the sensitive folder containing the schematic on Barlow's desk one evening, ensuring the lights were dimmed to force the Minox's shutter to remain open slightly longer, thus maximizing the chance of noise or blurring. A small, psychological victory, if nothing else. Barlow took the bait exactly as predicted. Surveillance teams watching the office from a hidden vantage point across the street observed Barlow linger late. He locked his door, pulled the documents closer, and appeared to be working on his own papers. After about 20 minutes, Volkov's men saw a brief, barely perceptible movement. Barlow reached into his coat pocket. "He's using the pen or the lighter," Volkov muttered into his radio link. "Get ready to move in as soon as he leaves the embassy grounds. We want the device, and we want the developed film." The arrest itself was low-key, occurring late that night near Barlow's apartment. The subsequent search was comprehensive. They found no Zippo or fountain pen cameras. They stripped Barlow's car, his briefcase, and even the heels of his shoes. Nothing. Barlow maintained his composure, smiling politely, insisting the charges were a gross misunderstanding. Colonel Volkov, furious at the seeming failure of the trap, reviewed the surveillance tapes obsessively. He rewatched the tiny, split-second movement Barlow made at his desk. It was too quick for a lighter, too unnatural for a pen. Barlow had simply touched his chest pocket and withdrawn his hand. The breakthrough came days later from a completely unexpected source, the U.S. counterespionage side. The FBI, during an unrelated surveillance operation on a Soviet contact in New York, arrested a courier carrying an American 5-cent piece, a nickel, that felt unnaturally heavy. The coin was brought to the FBI labs, where it was discovered to be a sophisticated two-part container, a hollow nickel. Inside, they found a piece of rolled-up microfilm and a Minox instruction manual. Volkov's team immediately cross-referenced the hollow nickel technique with Barlow's profile. Barlow was known to have a habit of checking the lining of his suit jacket and adjusting his tie. They recalled Barlow for a second, much more brutal interrogation. Under pressure, Barlow broke. He confessed that the CIA, having learned the KGB was searching for pen and lighter cameras, had issued their agents a new line of concealment devices based on everyday pocket detritus. His camera wasn't in a pen. It was integrated into a tie tack. The tie tack held the Minox lens and shutter assembly. To take a picture, Barlow simply had to lean forward, ensuring his tie was near the document, and press a tiny, concealed button sewn into the lining of his coat. The film was developed, rolled up, and placed inside a hollowed-out metal cufflink. The cufflink was then transferred to a diplomatic pouch. The Moscow trap had worked, but not in the way Volkov expected. The Barlow incident confirmed Volkov's darkest fear. The CIA was always 2 steps ahead. They had mastered the art of continuous disguise evolution, rendering any specific KGB search protocol obsolete within months. When a film from the tie tack was finally recovered, it had been transferred out of Moscow before Barlow's arrest. It contained the high-resolution, sharp images of the obsolete radar schematic. The CIA had successfully tested their new concealment platform, the tie tack camera and the cufflink storage, and acquired a classified document in the process. They were still laughing, not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of technical superiority. The price of the KGB's initial mockery of the toy cameras was proving to be an endless, exhausting, and humiliating game of catch-up. By the early 1960s, the technical espionage arms race had fundamentally changed the operational methods of the KGB's Second Chief Directorate. Colonel Volkov's team realized they couldn't possibly search every single pocket watch, shoe, or piece of jewelry by hand anymore. The volume of foreign visitors and diplomatic traffic was too high, and the disguises too sophisticated. The focus shifted from manual inspection to technological countersurveillance. The goal was simple: develop a technology that could instantly and non-destructively identify the presence of a functioning Minox mechanism concealed within any mundane object. Volkov dedicated a massive portion of the KGB's counterintelligence budget to the OTU, Technical Operations Directorate, challenging Colonel Kurchatov to build an anti-Minox machine. The initial attempts were rudimentary, focusing on simple physics. Acoustic testing. Since the Minox had a tiny, mechanical shutter, technicians used highly sensitive parabolic microphones to listen for the faint click of the shutter release when agents were near a suspected document. This failed miserably in noisy offices or when agents used cameras modified with silent shutters. Weight analysis. They tried to establish baseline weights for common items, lighters, pens, and weigh every suspect item with a precision scale. This was quickly defeated by CIA modifications that simply added small weights, like lead filings, to the empty space in a dummy pen, matching the weight of a functional camera pen. The solution finally emerged from an unlikely place: Soviet medical diagnostic equipment. The KGB began adapting low-level X-ray fluorescence, XRF, technology, originally designed for examining bone structure, to scrutinize object for internal mechanical complexity. The camera mechanism is metal, Major, Colonel Kurchatov explained, demonstrating the prototype device. Even if the casing is plastic or thin brass, the lens mount, the shutter spring, and the film cassette are dense. They will appear as a recognizable, concentrated cluster of complexity on the X-ray screen. The resulting machine, bulky and temperamental, was installed in a secure checkpoint at the entrance to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was disguised as an oversized baggage scanner, a piece of safety equipment required for all foreign visitors. The technique was revolutionary. Instead of dismantling every pen and lighter, an operative simply ran the object through the scanner. If a normal pen showed up as a simple metal tube, the ink cartridge, a Minox-type camera would immediately show the complex, layered optics and film cassette, a distinct, dense mechanical signature. The CIA quickly noticed the new, mandatory safety scanning procedures. Their analysts recognized the shift in KGB tactics immediately. They knew that X-rays would reveal the Minox's internal workings. The response was a third, equally rapid phase of Minox evolution, the non-metallic camera. CIA technicians began experimenting with new materials, specifically high-density plastics and ceramics, to fabricate the lens mounts and shutter mechanisms. While the film remained metallic, they used thinner, more diffuse materials for the spool and casing. The new generation of Minox was significantly harder to detect on the KGB's crude X-ray scanners. The espionage game had now become a race between concealment material science, CIA, and detection technology, KGB. In 1963, Colonel Volkov had his next major victory, one that vindicated the X-ray strategy. A West German trade delegate, Hans Gruber, was stopped at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs checkpoint. His briefcase contained a pair of expensive, tortoiseshell-rimmed reading glasses. On the X-ray monitor, Kurchatov's technician noticed a tiny, dense cluster of material hidden inside the thick plastic arm of the frames, exactly where the hinge mechanism should have been. Not a pen, not a lighter, not a tie tack, Volkov noted, watching the live feed. A pair of reading glasses. He could photograph documents on a table simply by looking down to read them. The glasses were seized. Inside the arm, they found a minute plastic-cased Minox camera, its lens looking out through a tiny, opaque section of the plastic frame. The film was successfully developed and contained photographs of Soviet industrial output data. However, the images were slightly distorted, with fuzzy edges, a direct result of the CIA's rushed attempt to use plastic optics to evade the KGB's X-ray machine. The KGB had pushed the CIA into sacrificing photographic quality for the sake of concealment. "We have them, Colonel," Kurchatov announced with pride, holding the flawed projection up. "The moment they start using plastics and compromising their optics, we are winning the technical war. They are sacrificing clarity for stealth." Volkov disagreed. "No, Colonel. We have only forced them to slightly degrade their intelligence. They're still photographing our secrets. Now, they know our X-ray capabilities. Next week, they will invent a camera powered by sound waves, or one hidden in a stick of chewing gum. We must anticipate the next move, not celebrate the one we just caught. The Minox taught us that the enemy will always look for the smallest, most plausible way to steal our security. We cannot rest." The capture of the glasses was a success, but it merely served as another chapter in the endless technical arms race ignited by the miniature camera. Colonel Volkov's skepticism about the victory of the X-ray scanner proved prescient. While the KGB was busy checking pens, lighters, and reading glasses for the Minox, the CIA executed a strategic shift. They began using the camera less for tactical document photography and more for strategic intelligence verification through double agents. This phase utilized the Minox not as a primary theft tool, but as an operational validation device. The CIA had successfully recruited a high-value double agent inside the Soviet Defense Ministry, a senior administrator named Pyotr Morozov, codenamed Needle. Morozov had access to genuine, high-level policy papers, documents far more sensitive than any blueprint Vance had captured years earlier. Morozov's handlers in the CIA did not want him to physically steal documents, which was too risky. Instead, they supplied him with a Micro-Minox 110, an even smaller model than the original, hidden inside the battery compartment of a large, imported transistor radio, an item Morozov carried everywhere as a prop to appear unremarkable. Morozov's task was simple. During his daily filing, he was to photograph key policy directives and handwritten marginalia from the Minister of Defense's personal files. The brilliance of this strategy lay in two areas: placement and purpose. Placement. Morozov operated within the deepest security perimeter. He was not a foreign national crossing a checkpoint, meaning he was never subjected to Volkov's X-ray scanners or pat-downs. The Minox was already inside the citadel. Purpose: the photos weren't of technical schematics, but of the minister's internal memos and notes regarding the deployment and doctrine of a new SS-7 Sadist missile. The CIA was moving from knowing what the Soviets had to knowing how the Soviets planned to use it. The Minox was now delivering high-level strategic policy. The intelligence Morozov provided was invaluable. The perfect clarity of the Minox film allowed the CIA to confirm the authenticity of the minister's handwritten notes, the subtle curve of his pen stroke, the shade of the ink, which was critical for verifying the agent's trustworthiness. The quality of the Minox photo was essentially the signature of the double agent's validity. Volkov's team, though highly successful at catching low-level agents, was completely blind to Morozov. They were looking for foreign spies on the perimeter. Morozov was a Soviet loyalist on the inside, seemingly above suspicion. The Minox intelligence delivered by Morozov allowed the U.S. president to make crucial decisions about the SALT-I treaty negotiations, armed with verified knowledge of the Soviet Union's true military intentions, not just their public posturing. The tiny camera had influenced geopolitics on a massive scale. The blow to the KGB eventually came in 1965, not through counterintelligence, but through a catastrophic internal security failure. Morozov was discovered when an envious colleague, attempting to frame Morozov for a paperwork error, found the strange, solid metal core inside the battery of his transistor radio. The colleague reported the anomaly to internal security, bypassing Volkov's network. When a Minox 110 was finally pulled out and the film developed, Volkov was handed a folder containing photographs of the Minister of Defense's private assessment of the Soviet Union's willingness to commit to a first strike scenario. The documents were so sensitive they had never left the minister's private office. Volkov felt a genuine wave of nausea. The documents were not blueprints, but the very essence of Soviet strategic decision-making. The camera, Volkov said quietly to Colonel Kurchetov, pointing at the tiny device. It is no longer the enemy. The enemy is trust. The CIA used the camera to leverage the trust we place in our own people. The arrest of Morozov exposed a gaping hole in Soviet security. Volkov realized that the X-ray scanners and checkpoint procedures only addressed the foreign threat. The internal threat, armed with a tiny, perfect camera, was exponentially more dangerous. The discovery forced the KGB to initiate a massive, secret internal investigation, codenamed Operation Needle Eye, to search for other deep-cover agents. The Minox had not only stolen secrets, it had forced the Soviet state to turn its suspicious gaze inward, leading to purges and a paralysis of trust across its most sensitive ministries. The CIA's little toy had become a corrosive agent of political destabilization. The exposure of Pyotr Morozov and the strategic secrets he photographed with the Minox sent tremors through the highest levels of Soviet government and military command. The fact that the most sensitive policy documents, the Minister of Defense's personal annotations on the SS-7 Sadist deployment, were compromised was deemed a security failure of the highest order. Colonel Volkov, despite having his theories vindicated, was now under immense pressure to contain the damage of Operation Needle Eye. The core problem, as Volkov identified it, was no longer the foreign agent, but the trusted insider armed with a miniature camera that left no trace. Since the Minox could be concealed in virtually anything and was already past all external checkpoints, the KGB's new directive was to destroy the opportunity for photography. This led to a radical, often absurd, transformation of security protocols inside key Soviet ministries and research facilities. Desk clearing doctrine. The rule was simple and draconian. All work surfaces must be completely cleared of papers when unattended, even for bathroom breaks. Custom-made, heavy, brass-bound safes were installed within the offices for momentary storage. Staff were timed on how quickly they could clear and secure their desks. Document standardization. All highly classified documents were printed on a thick, dark green or blue paper stock. The dark color was designed to confuse the automatic light metering systems of the Minox, forcing an overexposure. and to make the contrast between the white document and the dark desk less useful for framing. The buddy system. In all sensitive planning and review sessions, a two-man rule was instituted. No single person was ever allowed to be alone with documents. The second person's express duty was to watch the first person, specifically for unnatural movements, reaching into a pocket, adjusting clothing, or placing objects near the documents. This system was devastating to internal trust and morale. Volkov faced a bureaucratic nightmare. The strict application of these rules ground the already slow Soviet bureaucracy to a near halt. Engineers spent more time securing blueprints than designing missiles. Administrators complained that the constant need to police their colleagues was destroying working relationships. The Minox had successfully weaponized paranoia. "We are winning the technical battle," Colonel Volkov's deputy, Major Zaitsev, pointed out, reviewing the statistics. "We haven't found a foreign agent with a Minox in over a year. The X-ray is effective. We are losing the war of efficiency," Major Volkov countered, pointing to the reports of delayed ICBM deployment due to paperwork backlog. "The CIA's genius was making us fight their war, a war against a tiny camera. They have forced us to trade speed and trust for security." The backlash from the ministries was fierce. They argued that the constant surveillance and distrust were more damaging than the actual loss of a few blueprints. The political leadership, however, saw the photographs of the ministers' notes and were terrified. The solution was not to relax security, but to install even more pervasive, high-tech surveillance. This led to Project Shadow, the installation of miniature, hidden motion picture cameras, Soviet-made F-21 Ajax models, the KGB's first miniaturized internal camera, into every secure office. These cameras were not for espionage. They were for internal policing. They were hidden in clock faces, ventilation grills, and even inside the Soviet two-headed eagle crest on the wall. The purpose was to film every person who touched a sensitive document, creating an unquestionable record of behavior. The final irony was palpable. The KGB, which had laughed at the CIA's toy cameras, was now deploying its own miniature cameras, its own toys, to spy on its own citizens, all because they feared the perfect photographic evidence a foreign miniature camera could provide. The technological tool of the enemy was now the primary instrument of internal oppression. The Soviet state had been forced to adopt the methods of its adversary to defend itself against the consequences of a single, perfectly clear, enlarged photograph. The trust, once broken by the Minox, could only be repaired by ubiquitous, mechanical observation. The silent eye of the small camera was everywhere. By the late 1960s, the Minox camera, or variations of the miniature spy camera concept, had transitioned from a novelty to an indispensable staple of espionage on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Colonel Volkov and his KGB team, now highly proficient in detecting metallic and even plastic-cased Minox devices at checkpoints, were forced to grapple with the ultimate design challenge posed by the CIA: plausibility through ubiquity. The CIA's Technical Services Division, TSD, recognized that the more exotic the disguise, a belt buckle, a tie tack, the faster the KGB would catch on. The ultimate concealment, they reasoned, was in an object so common, so cheap, and so easily disposable that no customs agent or security guard would ever think to dismantle it. This led to the creation of the Minox in the trash. The TSD began integrating the Minox mechanism into objects used briefly and discarded: cigarette packets, disposable flashbulbs, and the cardboard tubes from toilet paper rolls, used primarily for intelligence transfer out of non-secured safe houses. The most ingenious disguise, however, was the camera concealed inside a hollow lipstick tube issued to female agents and female assets who had high-level access to sensitive areas. This new Minox generation was often a single-use device. An agent would receive the lipstick camera, use it to photograph a document in a quick moment of privacy, for example, in a bathroom break with the document briefly consulted, and then, rather than risk carrying the device, they would simply toss the empty lipstick tube into a public bin. Volkov's operatives were trained to look for complex mechanical signatures, They were not trained to retrieve garbage. The CIA had successfully weaponized the Soviet system's contempt for waste and bureaucracy. Who would search 1,000 public waste bins for a discarded piece of cosmetics? It's psychological warfare, Colonel, Captain Korovin observed bitterly. They're making us look for sophistication when the answer is in the refuse. They've shifted the risk from the agent's pocket to the city's trash. Volkov, however, saw the potential vulnerability in the sheer ubiquity. If the cameras were disposable, they were also likely mass-produced and cheaper, meaning the optics, while still good, might not be as precision-engineered as the 1950s models. This assumption proved true. The new disposable Minox models often used slightly inferior, easily replaceable lenses. The colonel ordered Operation Scavenger. KGB operatives, disguised as sanitation workers and street sweepers, were assigned to monitor high-traffic areas near foreign embassies, defense ministries, and known rendezvous points. Their job was not to arrest, but to retrieve any discarded foreign object and transport it to the OTU for X-ray analysis. It was a humiliating, manpower-intensive response, but it was necessary. In 1968, Operation Scavenger paid off. Near the American Embassy's trash compactor site, a team recovered a batch of discarded Western paper and packaging. Among it was a used, empty aerosol shaving cream can. Inside the can, glued to the bottom, was a small, perfectly intact, lipstick-cased Minox. The film inside was exposed. The developed photos, once again perfectly sharp, revealed something unexpected: microdot packaging instructions. The CIA was using the Minox to photograph documents, showing how to reduce a document to a microdot and how to conceal the microdot inside a piece of jewelry. They're using the camera to instruct their assets on how to use another method of espionage, Volkov realized, tracing the clean lines of the projected image. It's a recursive attack. They're diversifying their theft methods, and the Minox is the teacher. The captured lipstick Minox became the standard training aid for every new KGB recruit, no longer a source of mockery, but a profound lesson. The story of the Minox was no longer about a single piece of technology. It was about the fundamental principles of modern intelligence: concealment, clarity, and continuous evolution. The CIA had forced the KGB to acknowledge that the Cold War wasn't just fought with nuclear parity, but with the millimeter-perfect optics of a miniature camera. They had been laughed at for their toys, but those toys had stolen the Soviets' most guarded secrets, compromised their networks, and successfully forced the Soviet state into a paralyzing state of technological paranoia. The enduring legacy of the Minox wasn't the secrets it stole, but the absolute terror it instilled in the hearts of the men responsible for keeping those secrets safe. The story of the Minox camera transitioned from a thrilling intelligence skirmish in the 1950s into a pervasive, decades-long institutional paranoia within the KGB. By the 1970s and 1980s, the miniature spy camera had become a fundamental fixture in the KGB's operational history, taught as the paramount example of Western technological ingenuity and the failure of Soviet counterintelligence based on arrogance. Colonel Volkov, who had ridden the wave of panic, success, and frustration of Operation Pinpoint and Operation Needle Eye, had by this time been promoted to lieutenant general, responsible for coordinating technical counterintelligence across the Soviet bloc. His mandate was no longer just to find the cameras, but to anticipate the next technology that would exploit the same principles of concealment and clarity. The Minox and its Soviet counterpart, the A8 Colibri, standardized the requirements for all future KGB technical equipment. Every bug, every transmitter, every passive listening device developed by the OTU had to meet the Minox standard. It must be capable of being disguised as an innocuous, everyday object, and it must achieve its objective with absolute technical precision, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. But the most profound, lasting legacy of the Minox was the institutionalization of distrust. The internal security measures adopted in the 1960s, the buddy system, the constant filming of secure offices under Project Shadow, and the draconian desk clearing doctrine, never went away. They became permanent features of the Soviet system, fostering an atmosphere where colleagues were perpetual suspects. Consider the engineer, Yevgeny, working at the Kurchatov Institute on fusion research in 1982. Yevgeny spent more time filling out forms detailing why he needed to consult a classified manual than he spent reading the manual. When he stepped away from his desk, his assigned buddy, a humorless technician named Victor, would automatically place a heavy, lead-line cover over the documents, even if Yevgeny was only going to the water cooler 5 steps away. This wasn't because Victor suspected Yevgeny was a CIA agent. It was an ingrained, mandated response to a threat that had been proven real by the perfect photographs of the R-7 blueprints 27 years earlier. The Soviet security doctrine was now defined by the need to prevent the Minox moment from ever happening again. They were defending not against missiles, but against the fleeting, unguarded moment of a technical document left exposed on a desk. The CIA, for its part, understood the profound psychological damage it had inflicted. They continued to occasionally deploy Minox-type cameras, but more often, they used the threat of the camera. Planting a simple, empty fountain pen casing that resembled the notorious camera pen in the briefcase of a captured agent was enough to trigger a massive, wasteful, and paranoid security crackdown by the KGB, diverting resources and manpower. The Minox had become a ghost weapon. General Volkov, in a secret memoir written near the end of the Soviet era, reflected on the incident that defined his career. They laughed at the size. They mocked the idea of a camera being a toy. But the Minox was the ultimate weapon because it was invisible and its results were irrefutable. It took away our ability to deny the leak. When we saw those photos of the R-7 perfectly enlarged, we knew we had been humiliated. The laughter stopped and the fear began. That fear, the fear of the small, silent thing that watches you, is what brought the walls down on trust in our ministries. It was the crack that allowed the internal rot to begin. The irony persisted until the end. Even as the digital age dawned, and the CIA moved on to cameras the size of rice grains with solid-state memory, the KGB remained fixated on the physical, mechanical signatures of the classic Minox. The security rules drafted in response to a 1950s camera remained in force, ossified bureaucratic relics that testified to the deep, lingering trauma inflicted by a small piece of chrome disguised as a simple desk accessory. December 26, 1991. The Kremlin, Moscow. The Soviet flag, the red hammer and sickle, was lowered over the Kremlin for the final time. The Cold War was officially over. Yet for veterans like General Dmitry Volkov, retired but still a keen observer of the historical consequences, the roots of this colossal collapse were not found in political ideology or military expenditure alone, but in the small, early technical victories won by the West, often embodied by devices like the Minox camera. In the ensuing chaos of declassification and historical review, Volkov was instrumental in preparing a final, comprehensive analysis for the newly formed security services, an attempt to distill the most critical lessons of the Cold War technical espionage fight. The Minox story served as the foundation of his argument. He argued that the cost of the Minox to the Soviet state could not be measured merely by the blueprint stolen, the R-7, the Novosibirsk radar, the SS-7 doctrine, but by the resources diverted and the trust destroyed. Technical diversion, the years spent on Project Colibri, and the continuous effort to develop detection methods like the X-ray scanner, drained key Soviet optical and engineering resources. These resources, Volkov argued, should have been focused on strategic military projects, not on an endless game of cat and mouse with miniature cameras and their disguises. The technical effort was reactive, not proactive, and the Soviet system was constantly lagging by 3 to 5 years. Operational paralysis, the resulting security protocols, the mandatory desk clearing, the two-man buddy system, and the ubiquitous internal surveillance of Project Shadow created an atmosphere of stagnation. Bureaucrats, scientists, and military planners became terrified of making a mistake that would expose them as a potential Morozov. Decisions were delayed, innovation was stifled, and the flow of information necessary for a functional government was severely restricted. Volkov reviewed the original photograph, the hyperclear, enlarged projection of the R-7 combustion chamber. The memory of that image, taken by the Zippo camera of Howard Vance in 1955, remained as sharp in his mind as the lines on the blueprint itself. It was the moment the KGB stopped laughing and started fearing. That moment marked the start of a fundamental shift in the security paradigm. The Minox proved that perfect clarity equals undeniable proof. The ability of the CIA to capture secrets with high fidelity, verifying the authenticity of the information, made their intelligence exponentially more valuable than the often vague, generalized reports gathered through analog means. The Minox photographs gave the CIA the certainty required to confidently counteract Soviet strategic moves. The final lesson, Volkov concluded, was one of psychological warfare through technology. The miniature camera was designed not just to steal secrets, but to exploit the Soviet Union's deepest vulnerability, its inability to trust its own people. The KGB's initial ridicule of the toy cameras had stemmed from a combination of arrogance and adherence to outdated methods. They believed that large, complex secrets required large, complex tools. The CIA taught them the opposite. The most devastating secrets could be stolen by the smallest, most plausible, and most easily overlooked instrument. As Volkov closed his final report, he highlighted the enduring impact. Even in the new Russian security services, the training manuals for counter-espionage still featured detailed schematics of the Minox and the 8. The security rules of the buddy system and mandatory document control, though modified, still echoed the fears born in the mid-1950s. The legacy of the Minox was not merely a chapter in Cold War espionage. It was the story of how a small, well-designed piece of engineering, dismissed by its adversary as a joke, successfully became the corrosive element that crippled the internal operational trust of a superpower, forcing it to consume itself in a decades-long pursuit of an invisible threat. The captured rolls of film, revealing the perfect images, did more than inform the West. They fundamentally changed the way the Soviet Union governed itself.